Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. I say another ATP Geopolitics video because, well, John P151 here has just said work, ATP Geopolitics, sleep, work, ATP Geopolitics, sleep, repeat, rinse and repeat. That is my life as well. Like rinse and do a video, do another video, do another video. Oh my God, I've got more stuff in my head. I've got to do another video. But I'm incredibly happy to be joined today by Exit, who, if you guys have watched Andrew Perpetua's live streams, and I often talk about them, probably too often, you'll know that she appears regularly on his streams. So she's agreed to come and speak about sort of grain farming, agriculture. Her expertise is originally in agriculture, and as she'll probably say in a second, and how that pertains to Ukraine and particularly the Black Sea and grain exports and so on and so forth. So there's an awful lot to talk about. I'm really excited about this. Thank you for everyone else for joining in, and please just ask some fabulous questions in the live stream as you so often do. Anyway, that's enough rambling from myself. Exit, thanks so much for agreeing to come on. Welcome. And would you like to give people a little bit of an intro?
I would love to. Thanks for having me. So I'm Exit. I am from Alberta, Canada, so right near the Rocky Mountains. I grew up in a farming community, and well, most of Alberta is a farming community, let's be real. But I've worked on a grain farm for the last 12 years or so. And so my expertise coming into the full-scale invasion was actually how to grow grain and the full process of how that works at our farm and how we sell our grain, how we contract it, all of these different things. But I've always been a news hound who keeps a close eye on what goes on in the world and keeps a close eye on conflicts especially. And so when the full-scale invasion happened, it really obviously drew my attention like a lot of other people. And I was watching what was happening and realizing that the Black Sea exports were shut down. And I was realizing that food was going to be an issue very quickly for a number of people, not just in Ukraine, but all of the places that that food gets exported to out of Ukraine, because Ukraine is, at the time going into the full-scale invasion, it was the 5th largest supplier of wheat to the world. So not a small fry in the whole scheme of things by any means. And if people don't have wheat, they can't eat, and then people starve, and then they die eventually, and it's a pretty crappy story. So because I do farming as a living, I want people to know where their food comes from, and I want them to understand how it gets to them. And so nobody else was paying attention really to the idea that grain needed to get out of Ukraine and needed to get to all of the countries that it goes to feed the world. And I started paying attention to that and asking a lot of questions because I am nothing if not curious. I am absolutely one of the most curious people, and that's me.
Awesome. Well, yeah, there is a really wide spectrum of stuff that we could talk about. I guess the first place to start is probably how important is grain to Ukraine, and I know that's a question you could talk about for hours, but what part does farming play in Ukraine, and how is it important for how they operate as a country?
So the really interesting part about Ukraine generally, they are almost on the same latitude as I'm on. So Kyiv is actually only 1 degree higher than I am. I think I'm on 50 and they're on 51, if I'm correct. Which we only really just realized this in the last little bit, but excuse me, sorry. What's interesting about Ukraine is that a lot of their farming is a lot like what happens in Alberta. And so transferring that kind of understanding of how their grain farming works was actually really easy for me and really helpful. The vast majority of the east side of Ukraine and the south of Ukraine is all farming area. There's some up in the north near Kharkiv. There's a fair amount of farming. In the far western regions, it's much more mountainous, not as much farming as we would see kind of down in the plains area.
And of course, this area here was historically a bit of a dust bowl, irrigated eventually by damming the Dnipro River. Obviously, Novokakhovka Dam got blown, and that could put an end to some serious irrigation and crop yields in this whole region. I would have thought. Is that evidently, well, I presume it's still a massive worry for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, it's definitely a massive worry, even just from the perspective of drinking water. There are wells around there, but they aren't as deep as you might find in other places, is my understanding. And just not being able to back up the water at the Novokakhovka reservoir kind of really exacerbates all of the other water issues that you have in that entire area. And so now if you look at satellite images since the dam burst, going down into that whole area, obviously it gets drier as we go through the fall, because that would naturally happen as you're going into harvest. But I would expect that as we come into next spring, and you would normally see all of these irrigation channels full of water, they are saving up all the water that comes down the river during the winter into the dam and that reservoir area. Traditionally, they would have done that, and now they can't do that this year. So there's going to just be a lack of water that they can actually put through the Dnipro River there. And that means that there's no real water to lift up into all of these irrigation channels that they built through there. And so next spring is really when we're going to see the largest impact of all of that irrigation falling apart. All of those little circles you see on there are irrigation. And like that's the sprinkler going around in a circle. And so I would expect that next year we just won't see those on the same degree. Because it may be that way for even 5 years or more, depending on how long it actually takes to get the dam back up and running, because you just won't have the ability to control the water flow, that's the advantage of a dam, is controlling water flow and making sure that you have consistent water flow. All of the spring runoff is just going to flow down into the Black Sea, and they aren't going to have it to be able to feed all of these irrigation canals.
Holy moly, like I don't think I've done this before. I don't think I've really realized how many massive circles. That is insane. If you just the whole of this southern Zaporizhia and possibly even into Donetsk here is just circles. It's just incredible. And of course, all of those circles are requiring water to be fed into them, which would come from this reservoir that you are thinking next year probably won't. And this is why, historically, this whole area was a dust bowl and might well return to that. And I assume that they're not even beginning to think about rebuilding the Novokakhovka Dam, since it's right on the front line.
Well, they definitely thought about how they're going to rebuild it, and they already have partners signed up, different country partners signed up to address that when they can do it. But they really would have to push Russia a long ways back before it would make sense to put a huge amount of time and effort into that, because obviously you don't want to be halfway through that project and have it all blown up again or something else happen to it. So and even when they start rebuilding it, that's not a 1-year project. Most dams are kind of like along the idea of a 5-year project. And I mean, in 5 years, the amount of desertification that's going to happen in that whole area that you just looked at with all the irrigation, that's going to undo a lot of the work you've done to get rid of the desert area in there. Once those plants start to die, then the roots die, then the winds come through, especially during the summer and the fall, the winds come through and they start to tear up all of the topsoil. as soon as you've lost that topsoil, the plants kind of get ripped out by the roots. The roots are what really actually hold the main soil that you need there. And so if you suddenly just don't have roots from plants that can grow and hold everything there, all of that black soil and everything else is just going to blow away in the wind. And it will take years to bring that all back. And
That's such a good point, because it will. It's not just a quick fix. It's not like, right, we've rebuilt the dam, so therefore we can irrigate next year. Fantastic, let's grow all that stuff again. It's like, no, we have fundamentally lost the nutrients, the ability for the soil to generate the crops that we need. Yeah.
It's like, people don't really talk about that. David Helms is a person I work with really closely, and he is a meteorologist by training, and he has talked about that quite a bit. And yeah, that's David right there. I am lucky enough that he does weather reports for me every day. He also does weather reports for the front line, the line of contact, every day. People think that weather is really boring, but I can tell you that weather changes a lot of the things that we watch in Ukraine on a daily basis. And without that understanding of weather, and how it will affect all of these climate-based things that we need to start paying more attention to because of the destruction. Like, we're not even talking about the destruction of trees. If you listen to Andrew's stream, we talk all the time about, well, these line of trees has been deleted. Well, each of those lines of trees are windbreaks in between fields. And part of what they do is hold water, moisture, soil into those fields by not allowing wind to just whip through them unchanged. So you get, when those trees grow up, the wind hits the trees, it slows down just enough that the snow and anything else being carried in the wind can drop right behind those trees, and that moisture sits in the field and eventually feeds it for the next year. So that's why you see windbreaks in most agricultural plains areas. We have them here in Alberta. They've been planted years and years and years ago. And they're really important to producing the environmental factors that make more productive agriculture. So we're losing irrigation, in the south, and then we're losing trees up in the north, which trees will grow back eventually. It'll take probably less time than rebuilding the dam and restarting all of that irrigation, but it's going to have a fairly decent impact on the environmental factors that affect agriculture and how much grain you can grow.
Interesting. I mean, goodness me, yeah. And we're going to talk about the weather a little more with regard to the Black Sea. Before we get onto the Black Sea, to talk about, okay, well, the importance of the export channels for all this grain that is hopefully grown. I don't know if you can answer this. ATP Geopolitics, can you also exit about the internal Russian canal or river system linking the Black, Baltic, Caspian, its capacity, and if Russia used it to move naval assets? I don't know if that's anything you would know about.
I know a very small amount about that. So I'll tell you what I know, and I won't tell you what I don't know. I don't know how many naval assets they move through there. I do believe there is some, but I don't have any real knowledge on that. So I'll stay away from that part. They do move quite a bit of exports and imports through that area. So we've seen concrete exports, we've seen grain exports, a lot of that stuff going into kind of the Middle East area. There isn't so much any checks on that. So we actually saw kind of at the beginning of 2023, we saw Russia kind of stockpiling ships that could operate in that area because they can kind of export through that area without having the same international checks or the same international eyes on what they're doing, as opposed to what's going on in the Black Sea.
That reminds me. It brings me on, I guess, to something connected there, which is there was this news that came out this week that there's an investigation into Russia concerning uh, international sort of war crimes, international criminal court, with regard to Russia buying up some grain sort of storage and export infrastructure before invading. And there's this idea that their invasion wasn't just about um, unseating the Kiev government, but there might have been this idea to do a kind of Holodomor Mark II and capitalize on their own grain exports, stealing Ukrainian grain exports, and effectively, causing a starvation for Ukrainians yet again. Is that anything that you can talk to at all?
So I probably have a little bit of an unpopular opinion about that report.
Mm-hmm.
I understand the evidence that they're looking at. I understand what they're trying to demonstrate there. I'm not sure that it takes into account the fact that agriculture in that entire area has always been cross-border. It hasn't been like you were just dealing. So I personally, in the last 2 years, work really closely with some agronomists and other people in agriculture in kind of Eastern Ukraine. And the majority of them worked not just in Eastern Ukraine, but also the Western part of Russia right there. Like these were not generally separate economies. They very much crossed borders on a fairly regular basis. Agriculture on one side of the border was very similar to agriculture on the other side of the border. That is still not really all that different. Obviously, there's less crossing of the border, and Ukraine is much more protective of things. But seeing Russian companies buy up assets in Ukraine was not an unusual thing. And you would have had other Ukrainians and other people from the Baltic states and whatnot buying up assets in Russia as well. Like there was a lot of cross-border economic transactions there. And so I understand why people are trying to track that and see if there's something about those trends that lends us to believe there was more to it. I haven't necessarily seen enough information or evidence that I would agree to that just yet. I'm not saying it's not there.
Yeah.
I'm saying I would need to see a lot more because I think
actually, I think that makes less sense of that whole idea that they'd be trying to starve out Ukraine on purpose. Makes less sense of the idea that they were trying to go for a quick turnover of the government anyway, and this was just going to be a big puppet state of Russia. So that what you're saying would accord. I mean, it sounds quite similar to an analog of Northern Ireland and Ireland with regard to how farming works across those borders.
Absolutely. Like whether or not there's a war going on, the people who live in those border regions are half the time they're still related by blood to people on the other side of the border. Like if you live and grow up in one specific area, your family eventually gets a little bit bigger. One person moves across the border, they marry into the next family. Like it's just a normal propagation of people evolving in a space, and borders really don't mean a whole bunch to people just living their life and farming and all of those other things. And if I can cross the border and buy a whole bunch more land for a little bit cheaper because of a tax structure or whatever the case may be, as a farmer, I'm probably going to do that because I probably can just keep farming that land with the same assets that I already have.
And of course, I mean, there's quite a few tidbits of conversation in the live chat about mining and demining. I presume, it's pretty obvious that is going to be a real challenge going forward. It'd be interesting to know how much. I mean, because when you look at the whole of Ukraine, you think, okay, if the borders, if the front lines are here, I mean, it's a massive amount of land that has been mined. But actually, in the whole scheme of things, it is it's not as much as one might think, thankfully, because otherwise you'd spend like 200 years demining. But
Well,
it is still going to be a massive challenge, because then you've got areas of Kharkiv where the Russians have been, not
yeah.
just where they are presently, and we don't know where the war is going to go going forward.
So pretty much everywhere that the Russians have been, including up to Kyiv and through that whole area when they first invaded, that all has been mined at some point or another, and extensively mined. And demining is something that is very near and dear to my heart, entirely because you see consistently farmers trying to farm their land and hitting mines. And so the last estimate I saw was they thought it would take something like 76 years to demine Ukraine. I am privileged to know some of the people who do demining efforts in Ukraine on land, and they are working really closely to basically create new technologies that would kind of speed up the demining.
Yeah.
But the understanding the quantifiable amount of mines that are laid in Ukraine right now is kind of it's so many that it's not easy to grasp in your head how much work is in front of those people.
Yeah, it's just phenomenal amounts. And so let's then talk about the importance of the Black Sea. So you've got a nation that is to some extent the breadbasket of the world, or a breadbasket of the world, and we mustn't forget that Russia is that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a vast country with huge capabilities, or capacity, sorry, of grain export and output. But the Black Sea is super important. So what was the kind of situation before the war, and then at the outbreak of the war, especially given the Montreux Convention that allows Turkey to shut down the Bosphorus Straits here to stop military vessels going in and out of the Black Sea? What was the situation with the grain export? How did it operate, and how did that change over the course of the war?
So if you look at pretty much all of the Black Sea adjacent ports for Ukraine, you will still find ships in each of those ports that are stuck from before the war. Mykolaiv, and there's another one up there that I can never remember the name of. It starts with an O. But those
Kyiv, or this one further up?
Yeah. Oh. No, that one. Those still have ships stuck in them from before the war. Exporting grain and most goods through deep sea ports is by far the most economical way to do it. And so continuing, like before the war, there was lots of exports. They went through each of those ports. There was consistent traffic in and out of Ukraine through Odessa, Mykolaiv. The Danube River ports were not as important, but they were still important. And a huge portion of their exports went through each of those ports. When the full-scale invasion happened, at the same time, we saw Russia's military essentially shut down and start to interdict with each of those ports. They even sunk a cargo ship, like a civilian cargo ship, in the very first days of the war. And essentially there was, I think in Odessa, there was at least 10 cargo ships that were sitting in ports that were stuck there for a good portion of the time. There's still 2 in Odessa that are actually stuck from before the war that still have not left. One is actually in Odessa, and it's parked right outside the hotel that was hit. It was intended to one pier over north. No, sorry. So the little X, or the little box, there's that box. Yep. So go one pier south of that.
South of that. So this one.
There. Yeah. So the Comet is a ship that has lived for the extent of the war so far on that pier. right near the hotel. She was actually ready to sail, and then Russia struck that hotel with a missile a couple months ago, and the debris landed on the Comet and caused some damage, and so they've been working on fixing that. So she's stuck, and then there's another one called the Chris 3, which is actually down in Chernomorsk, and she was owned by Russian owners at the time that the full-scale invasion started. And so she has actually been confiscated by the Ukrainian government, and she will sit there for a good long time, is my understanding, until they get that sorted out legally. And her sister ships export grain and other goods out of Sevastopol and Novo, and there's a few other areas around there that they work out of.
And so, what happened previously was that they were able to export the grain kind of freely through the middle of the Black Sea in a more efficient route, all the way down to Bosphorus Straits, and that was all happening. I guess to the benefit of everyone. They come to this kind of agreement, but then Russia wanted to flex its muscles, and then things change. Goodness, what was the trigger for Russia stopping the grain export route corridor?
The entire idea, well, I mean, ultimately Russia wants to take over Ukraine, and so part of how you win a war is that one of the ways that you win a war is that you can essentially bankrupt the country that you're trying to take over. So you do that by shutting down their economy in every way that you can. And so if you shut down their most effective, cost reasonable way to export, and you essentially for the first, that'd be 6 months of the war, you're completely shutting down their exports in general. They hadn't really gotten the solidarity lanes back up. The Danube River ports were still operating, but they even trying to increase those exports out of those river ports. You can only take smaller ships into there, and B, it takes time to kind of put in the extra infrastructure to increase exports out of that area. And you have to, those Danube River ports are so far south in Ukraine that you have to transit all of these goods down to those ports. The rail lines were busy exporting, but also they were being hit, especially in the earlier parts of the war. They were often hit with missile attacks. Rail export was not the most important thing that their rail line was doing. It was doing a lot of humanitarian work. It was importing a whole bunch of stuff that needed to come in, just like weapons and all of these other things, goods and services. It wasn't concentrating on exporting goods out. And so they essentially shut down a huge portion of Ukraine's economy in general and the money flowing into the country, because they could shut down most of their export potential quite quickly.
And what do you feel about, or what is indeed, I don't know if you know, the international legal framework for whether hitting port infrastructure is a bona fide military target?
So it's not, unless you
It's not. So they're a bunch of criminals, and that's the end of that conversation. Next question, please.
Unless you're operating, unless you can say that you have factual proof of them operating very specific military operations out of there, which, let's not be silly. I'm sure that, well, we know for certain that there is air defense assets, for instance, around Odessa and area. There has to be, because Russia keeps attacking them. So there are military targets around those areas, but there's a big difference between a military target that is actual military installation, be it temporary or not, versus grain warehouses, which they intentionally, consistently target. Those are not military targets. Ukraine is very specifically publishing video every time one of those gets hit. And you can see that there's grain inside of those grain storage areas, of those warehouses. It's not a military target. There's no argument for making it a military target. Ukraine intentionally, when they target things inside Russia or inside occupied Crimea, they make sure that they don't hit targets like that, because they are only targeting military targets, even though there's a really good argument to be made for them doing some likewise
Yeah,
crap.
I find it's really interesting because in my head I can see both sides of the argument. So Russia has hit them, and it's the same with the energy infrastructure as well. So
Yeah,
we hear that Russia hit the energy infrastructure, and you can understand that from a kind of strategic military point of view in getting that advantage over your enemy, even though it's a war crime, right? You're thinking, right, we can debilitate their economy because that then debilitates their ability to prosecute a war. And Ukraine have said they are actually up for taking out Russian energy infrastructure in a kind of tit for tat going forward as they develop their own kind of drone capabilities and missile capabilities. And you're thinking, on the one hand, I totally get that. But on the other hand, how does that look? And this is the problem for Ukraine, is that they have to prosecute this war knowing that international eyes are on them, and they have to be the moral do-gooders, if you like. And Russia can get away with just doing anything they like because, do you know what? To hell with it. They've already broken all the rules anyway. So they can happily go and destroy infrastructure, whether it be grain, export, or energy infrastructure. And Ukraine are kind of thinking about doing that, but they also don't want to piss off international onlookers who are giving them so much valuable aid.
absolutely. And I mean, I think we have seen Ukraine start to target some energy infrastructure inside Russia, but it's almost exclusively related to energy infrastructure that feeds bases specifically,
yeah.
and other military infrastructure.
Yeah.
They are not, there is every reason that you could watch them target some major infrastructure around Rostov-on-Don and a lot of those other places. And they are choosing not to do that. And they are absolutely being the moral good in this. And frankly, I'm like, as much as people go out there and say that they should target those things, I am like oddly proud of the fact that they don't do that, because I think it really does demonstrate how different they are and the massive moral differences between the two countries.
Yeah, really agree. It's so we have this situation, as I mentioned, whereby where's it gone? Draw on page. There we go. So the old route went something like that. Oh no, it didn't. That's absolutely ghastly. Let's. So I haven't used this for ages. This particular thing. Anyway, so the old route went. If you're talking about Odessa, went something like there. And now the route is hugging the shallow waters all the way around here. And this is one that hasn't been agreed upon with Russia. So this is not a Russia-sanctioned route. This is like, screw you, Russia, we're going to do what we're going to do. With the say-so of, say, Romania and Bulgaria. What is the difference between these two routes? What are the ramifications of doing this new route that hugs the coast?
So let me scroll back in timeline just a little bit. So in July of 2022, they started the Black Sea Grain Initiative. That was a cooperative initiative between Turkey, the UN, Russia, and Ukraine. And they followed mostly that old route there. They actually did have kind of, during that route, some of the smaller ships would still travel up kind of a little bit closer to the coast, but generally there wasn't any real problem with them kind of traveling anywhere in that area, because it was technically agreed upon that Russia would not attack any of those ships or do anything.
Even though they did actually stop them, right? And they actually had legal right to stop them too.
That was outside the
blockades.
Well,
yeah, sorry, I'm jumping.
No, that's okay. So they would inspect each of the ships running that route, but the inspection was done down in Istanbul. There was a joint coordination center down there, and all four countries kind of had, or all three countries in the UN kind of had to agree what was done each day. During kind of October, November of 22, it worked really well, and everybody worked together as they should. And then we saw the attack on the Kerch Bridge, and Russia immediately pulled back kind of their cooperation there. And we saw productivity in the Black Sea Grain Initiative drop off from being like really quite productive and a useful tool to being, by the end of it, there was like 2 ships going in and out per week, which is just not useful to anybody, essentially. So then that agreement essentially ended in July of 23, so this year. And by September 15th is essentially when they started sailing new ships into Odessa, Chernomorsk, and Yuzhny, which are those 3 ports right around the Odessa area. They do technically have an inner route, which is what most of the ships have stuck to. And they stuck to that really specifically earlier on, because in that time span between when the Black Sea Grain Initiative ended and when the Ukrainian corridor began, we saw Russia stop a ship that was actually going to the Danube River ports. And so a really important distinction that I think a lot of people missed is that the Danube River ports were never screwed with by Russia until the Black Sea Grain Initiative ended. Russia allowed them to operate, basically acted like they just didn't even exist. They didn't do anything about the ships there. They really didn't target them with missiles for the most part. They kind of just ignored them. And that was obviously quite useful, because at least Ukraine could export some things out of there. And to be frank, the amount of exports that go out of there isn't huge. So probably in their equation of what's important and what's not, it just wasn't all that big on the list of things to do. So, but in that time period between the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the Ukrainian corridor, we saw Russia stop a ship from one of those Ukrainian ports and inspect it. It was technically a legal inspection, even though there's a lot of people who don't want to talk about that or think it was more piracy, or they want to frame it in a different way. That's not accurate, and they aren't helping the situation by doing that, in my opinion. The same with saying that it was a blockade. Those Danube River ports were never blockaded. There was still ships going in and out of them, even at the height of the missile attacks, which were happening like every night. There was still ships going in and out of them. It wasn't a blockade. A blockade legally means that you cannot allow any ships to go in or out, and that wasn't the case. But getting back to your bigger question, sorry. So we saw for the majority of the first part of the Ukrainian corridor, ships going along that really close pathway, kind of hugging the shore. They're hugging the shore because it's just safer. For a good portion of it, they're in NATO waters there, and then back up right where the color changes, obviously you're in Ukrainian water. But if you're hugging the coast, you can be underneath Ukrainian air defense and just have a little bit more safety because it's a little bit more shallow there. It's not as easy for Russia to kind of interdict with any of those ships. However, we have seen consistently, other than about 2 weeks when Russia was reportedly, and I use the word reportedly there mildly, I think there's a lack of clarity about the reports that Russia was dropping mines from planes in the Ukrainian corridor. It doesn't there's just not a lot of information about that. And so I believe it happened. I just don't know exactly what happened or where it happened. And there hasn't been more information about it. Other than the 2 weeks when that was happening, we have still seen some ships go on the outside lanes. And they are definitely in international waters there. They're operating at 34 kilometers off the coast, and I think it's 22 kilometers off that would still be Ukrainian land or Ukrainian water. But they have not been fussed with by Russia at all when they've gone down that deeper line. And that line is safer for the bigger Panamax ships that we're watching go in and out.
And so, well, several things. I mean, we can talk about mines. We can also talk. We'll come to mines maybe a little bit later. We'll talk about the volume of shipping that's taking place at the moment. So today's an interesting day because I think it's the highest volume of boats operating or ships operating. Sorry, along that corridor at the moment. Is that correct? Is it looking good, really, considering where they?
Yeah, so actually, as we've been sitting here on this call, I had confirmation that 2 more ships were southbound today. So that actually brings us up to, I believe, 23 ships that operated in the corridor today, which is by far the biggest day that we've had so far. I think that's up 5 from the last biggest day. And so part of the reason that's happening is because there was a giant storm on the weekend. And so there would have been ships kind of backlogged that were supposed to go in during the storm and just couldn't sail. And then also we've seen much more consistency since the missile attack that hit the cargo ship in the port of Yuzhny. We've seen much more consistency from shippers going in and out. And we seem to have almost always every day we're having at least 4 ships in and out.
Which is fantastic, and that is, I mean, I suppose that's really what they want. Obviously, that's what they want. Is you were kind of mentioning that they're smaller ships that hug the coast. So is it still a case that there isn't the desired output really or tonnage that's needed if they are having smaller ships? And also it goes on to this idea that they're kind of testing the area with smaller ships, but then smaller ships have just, some of them have just hit mines. One's broken up today on in really bad weather, if I can find that. So talk to me about some of those ideas.
Okay, so about mines, number one, there has been a history of mines in the Black Sea since World War II. They put a ton of mines into the Black Sea during World War II. And last year, a good portion of the mine stories that you saw around the Black Sea were actually World War II mines. They weren't mines from this current conflict. So when you see those things, understand that it's a long-term thing that's been happening in Ukraine and in the Black Sea. It's not unknown to insurers and other people who have to make the estimation of whether they're going to sail in or out of Odessa. It's not a nothing, but it's a little bit lower on the list of things you have to worry about. And specifically on the 18th, we saw one of the ships leaving Odessa, and just outside the port area, she hit a mine, a floating mine. And it was very minor damage, literally just cosmetic damage that actually happened to that ship. And that is like the 4th one in the last 4 weeks. It's not great, but it's probably not going to stop shipping. On the weekend, we saw this storm, which had 4-meter waves, was absolutely hellacious, broke apart this particular ship on in the middle of a port town in Turkey. It's just like, it blows my mind. However, I would note that that particular ship is 55 years old. When we're talking about ships going into and out of Odessa, the ship people that I talk to and get a lot of knowledge from have told me specifically, like, even at 20 years old, a ship is fairly old and it's probably already paid for. And that's why we see at the beginning of the Black Sea Grain Initiative or the Ukrainian corridor, we saw a lot of these older ships making those trips, because when you're talking about a risk evaluation for an older paid for ship that's much smaller, the risk is much lower than you would see for the giant 300-meter long Panamax ships that go in and out of there today. So that ship, it's unfortunate that that happened. It actually had its anchor down, but it was inside the kind of secluded port area, but the anchor dragged and the ship sailed, or essentially just washed up on shore and broke apart, and it's a disaster. There's actually live streaming or like live video from them making their emergency call and from them getting rescued. It's all quite amazing. And there's another ship in that same port that also had to be rescued. And it's my understanding that they actually, even though the ship was in the port area, they somehow have lost all the sailors off of that ship. So it sounds like it was even more dangerous than we kind of understood it to be at the time. But so those are like known things that insurance companies and shippers and sailors, all of these things, they take those into account. They're a known risk. They're not like on the scale of 1 to 10 when you're looking at them. They're not as high as a missile attack. However,
so these are two different like insurance things. So one is weather, right, and the other is war risk, and those two, as you say, are very different thing. And they're used to kind of weather that shouldn't really affect your insurance costs going forward. You would expect those kind of things to happen on a yearly basis all around the world, etc., etc. However, getting hit by a Russian rocket, Russian missile is not something that usually happens, so that will affect, I presume, insurance rates.
Yeah, so the war risk insurance that you're talking about kicks in while they're in the Ukrainian waters, essentially. So as they enter the Ukrainian corridor, while they're sitting at the port in Ukraine and then on their way back out, that war risk insurance is really important, and it's what covers pretty much any amount of damage that happens during that time. Obviously, weather damage wouldn't fall into that, but it covers most of essentially Russia causing damage to any of these ships. So we have seen kind of an evolution of that. When the Ukrainian corridor started, that insurance was quite expensive. It was prohibitively expensive to the point where it raised the cost of those exports so much that it was really difficult to get people to buy grain out of Ukraine, because it just was more expensive, because the insurance was more expensive and the shipping cost was more expensive, all of those types of things. Now that we've seen it operate for an extended period of time, those insurance costs have dropped until we saw the missile attack. And so the missile, you have a thread there from David about the missile attack and kind of his evaluation of what happened with the damage that we saw and the type of missile and all of those things. Not that one.
Which one? Not that one.
It's fine. Don't worry about it. I'll find it and send it to you here for a second.
Yeah. No worries. Yeah, because this is where the British came in, and I presume others might be doing this as well. But one of the things I've talked recently this week about, there are certain nations that are doing things we don't realize they're doing. So I'm sure many nations, maybe all the people helping Ukraine are doing things that we were not aware of under the radar. And one of the things the UK government is doing is, because of the close relationship between the UK government and maritime insurance, that it's almost like a monopoly, not a single firm, but most of the firms are based in the UK, is that this is how we've been able to affect the oil price cap by saying you can't get insured ships if you're selling oil at more than $60 a barrel. And that's at least... that was a theory and it worked at the beginning, but now there are loopholes, etc., etc. But also the UK government has paid or underwritten or paid for those excess insurance costs as a result of that rocket attack. And so that allows Ukraine to still export grain at the same kind of rates that they were before the rocket attack. That's how I understand it.
Yep, you got it spot on. I think a lot of people don't realize that the majority of insurance sellers and resellers in North America and Europe are all, well, and in a vast majority of the world, are all based out of the UK. They all lead back to the 4 or 5 main companies there. And
Lloyd's being one of the main ones, but
yeah, exactly. And they have done really great work to kind of cut down on sanctions evaders, to report on things like that. And specifically, they have worked with Ukraine in ways that we haven't seen them work with other countries who are being invaded or have war issues going on. And I give all the props to insurers, because there's a lot of discussion about, well, these insurance prices shouldn't be so high because it's cost prohibitive for all of these other things. You need to realize that insurers have taken a massive hit in Ukraine with the amount of money that they've had to spend paying out on different things that have been insured and then been destroyed by the war. Insurers have done a really good job of supporting Ukraine, and they don't get enough credit for that. I will be the first one to sing their praises for that. And they've worked with them in ways that we just don't traditionally see them work with them. And so and as you said, the UK government specifically, and US aid definitely has a role in not underwriting, but in supporting some of that price adjustment work as well. And they don't get enough credit either. But there is tons of work being done by allied countries to support Ukraine's economy through exports, either by making sure that ships get booked in and out of the corridor and other places, or supporting them through insurance and other kind of side things that need to be done in order to allow these pieces to work.
And I guess that's why it's so frustrating for Ukraine to have this kind of Polish issue at the border, with also the idea about, you know, the worries of flooding grain. I mean, we've had Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland complaining about cheap European or cheap Ukrainian grain and other agricultural products flooding the market and therefore undercutting the European farmers' prices. And now we've got the farmers joining in the truckers at the borders going into Ukraine from Poland. It's all a bit of a hot mess that really needs to be sorted out, because that's not 100%. Helping anyone.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm a farmer, so take this from a person who understands this. However, I will be the first person to point out, that grain prices were really, really high up until kind of the very end of 2022. And so just a little farming note, when you go to sell your grain, you can sell it on contract, which means that you essentially say, I'm going to have this much grain in September of 2022, and I would like you to buy it now and contract it at this particular price, and I will deliver it then, and you can pay me for it then. Farmers in most of the EU had the opportunity to contract out a good portion of their grain at those higher prices. And some people chose not to contract their grain at those higher prices because they thought grain prices would go up even higher. Grain prices didn't necessarily go up even higher, and they left money on the table, and they're frustrated about that, and it impacted them economically. It's one of a whole bunch of things that impacted them economically at the same time, and it caused a lot of frustration. Ukraine is probably taking a little bit more of the blame than is actually due to them. But regardless, all of that blame really shouldn't have anything to do with Ukraine. And it's entirely just a function of Russia's full-scale invasion. And think there's a vast majority of people that are frustrated about it because they're in a bad spot economically. They want somebody to help them out, but they're not really laying the blame at the foot of the people who should be blamed for it, because those people can't do anything about it. Russia doesn't give a flying shit. This is actually really helpful to them.
Yeah. I mean, any kind of discord is helpful for them, particularly if it's affecting Ukraine's ability to make money from exporting their core exports. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And any amount of discord means that you're going to have other countries who maybe pull back on some of their military funding to support Ukraine because they need to send more money to their farmers to keep them afloat. All of these other things.
Yeah.
Like, it's just another portion of the economic destruction that Russia is trying to enact on Ukraine. And it's a piece that we don't hear talked about enough, because it really does impact the military side of things, because money has to come from somewhere to keep the defense going. And if you have to take that money and use it to support your own economy, because of all of these follow-on knock-on effects, you don't have as much to give Ukraine to defend itself. And that is part of the strategy that Russia has, and we just don't talk about it enough.
This brings me on to something I haven't actually thought about before, but we talk about how supply and demand has affected oil and gas prices around the world, and that has affected Russian ability to make money off hydrocarbons. And there are certain situations where they're selling more of it, but selling it at a lower cost or lower price, and therefore they're not actually getting as much in real terms and less than they were budgeting for. But I'm wondering about agricultural produce, because their agribusinesses haven't been affected. They surely, the prices, as you've said, the prices certainly previously was sky high for grain and other products. So I would guess that Russia has done quite well out their own agricultural exports.
They've done fairly well. Yeah, they definitely aren't seeing the problems that we're seeing out of Ukraine. There are some things that are actually affecting their agricultural abilities, and the biggest, most impactful one,
fertilizer,
excuse me, is the ability to get parts for agricultural machinery. Okay. There's been sanctions on that since kind of early in 2022, and that is finally starting to have an effect. I expect that most of that will be cleared up by China at some point. It's almost certainly probable that they'll either start creating their own parts in country, or they'll kind of augment that with parts from China or other parts of Asia that they still operate with. But like, for instance, John Deere tractors, they're basically the biggest producer of tractors in the world. They have, and almost every tractor now has software in it. If you can't update that software for your tractor or your combine or whatever else, your vehicle just won't operate the way that it should, and eventually it will break down faster than it should. There isn't like a China replacement for that software. People are starting to develop that, but generally my understanding is that they don't work as well as the John Deere software that it comes with. So like, all of those things will eventually start to break down their agricultural ability to operate. But it's not nearly to the degree that we're seeing happen in Ukraine generally.
So talking about the ports, the Ukrainian grain export ports, both on the Danube and on the Black Sea coast, are the Russians still targeting them? Because it's been really quiet in terms of cruise missile usage, and there has been some talk, and maybe you can enlighten me on this, but there's been some talk that Russia, in moving their Black Sea fleet from Sevastopol to Novo, that they are unable to actually load the ships with cruise missile. That the loading capability is still in Sevastopol, and that's producing a bit of a problem. And then there's also the idea that they're stocking up on cruise missiles to give some kind of hellish saturation attack of cruise missiles at some point, which is something I'm particularly worried about. But we've seen Russia not attack the ports as much in the last couple of weeks. Are there still attacks going on that we're not hearing about? Are the ports better protected from newfound air defenses, or is it just quiet before the storm?
So kind of all of the above. So there are new air defenses and there are more coming. We have seen less attacks, but of the attacks that are happening, they seem to be less reported generally. Even I, who pay fairly close attention to this, seem to see less reporting on this recently. And I think part of that is just because everybody is so focused on, are we at a stalemate on the line of contact, and just not really paying attention to all these other pieces that are coming up. The idea that Russia can't load caliber missiles out of Novo, I've asked a lot of people about that. I have not found very many people that are convinced of that yet. There is definitely a lack of infrastructure there in the same way there is in Sevastopol, but it is not immediately apparent that they cannot load out of there. Although I think they are definitely operating less currently. That is illustrated by the fact that there's an account on Twitter called MT Anderson. He often will pull up satellite images of each of those Russian ports. If you look at Novo, there's been the Kilo class submarines have been there and haven't really been moving out of there most of the time. They're almost always there in almost every shot lately. So they're just not operating at the same tempo that they were out of Sevastopol. Why that is exactly, I don't think we have enough evidence to actually say that yet. But the fact they are operating less is definitely a benefit, no matter why that's actually happening.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it's interesting. And this port is a smaller, shallower port that doesn't have the facilities that Sevastopol has. And this means that it's a very poor cousin. It was due to be upgraded in 2014 onwards, I believe, but they scrapped that due to the fact that they annexed Crimea and took over Sevastopol, and that this port allows them, it has much greater dry dock capabilities, much bigger port. They can moor all their ships inside the port entrance, so it's just a lot better.
It's a lot better, but I just don't know that it's tenable anymore after the attack, Ukraine kind of just proving that they can continue to attack them and that they now have the long range missiles, and the dry docks, especially, I think anywhere in Crimea that has dry docks, Ukraine has now kind of said, okay, well, we can attack them. So any ship that you put in a port in Crimea, we are probably going to hit it at some point or another. It is absolutely something that you need to be aware of, and we are going to make use of it. I'm sure that last attack that we saw in Kerch was entirely intended to just put a point on that head that, there's nothing inside Crimea that we can't hit. And if you don't understand that, this particular hit is to demonstrate that to you specifically. Yeah. And especially because we know that the missiles came from different directions there. It was intended to say, listen, we know what you're doing in Crimea. We know where your positions are in Crimea. We know we can hit this spot, and you need to know that we know all these things.
That's a really good point. And it can't be overemphasized, really, how important that is. I mean, this is a massive win for the Ukrainians. You can say what you like about the stalemate or the lack of gains territorially for the Ukrainians on the front line. But what they have done is they've changed the Russians' behavior of the entire Black Sea Fleet, and they've got the Black Sea Fleet to move out of Sevastopol to Novo. And as I've said many times, this is one of the main reasons this entire war is taking place. They want Crimea, and they want a land bridge to Crimea. That's it. And if they can't use Crimea for what they need or want to use it for, then the whole thing is kind of pointless. And Ukraine, in in one metric at least, has kind of won the war. Now, I know that's a massively bold statement, but literally, if your objective is to use Crimea and use it in conjunction with a land bridge, and Ukraine has severed the rail links through this land bridge such that Russia is now trying to build a new railway system, and Ukraine has said, and we can hit every single port on Crimea, and Ukraine has said, and by the way, we've hit the Kerch Bridge, and we can cut, they've kind of communicated that they can do that. They just don't want to do it yet, or don't want to do it at the moment. Then Russia is thinking, actually, practically and pragmatically, Crimea is of little use to us at the moment, and that is so huge. Sorry, I'm ranting.
No, it's great. That is a rant I will absolutely listen to every day, because I am the first person to say to literally anybody who will listen that I get kind of mad every time somebody says Ukraine doesn't have a navy, because arguably they have been one of the most productive services in the Ukrainian armed forces during the majority of this entire full-scale invasion, despite the fact that they have very little in terms of assets. And when you're looking at just what they've done essentially this summer and leading into the fall, yes, it took a lot of time and planning and development and thinking outside the box of how to work towards this with tools that were absolutely different than what you would see in a traditional Navy. But man, I sure hope that somebody is actually writing down all the stories and all the achievements of what Ukrainian Navy does, because it is an untold story that needs to be celebrated when this is all done. Because like, if you think about the fact that we see 50% of what their Navy does, but there's a huge amount of stuff that we don't even know about that they're doing in a regular basis. That's as part of the quote unquote OSINT community. I've had a lot of chats with people about, like, the Black Sea is this weird place where 90% of what happens there, we just don't even know it's actually happening, because it either doesn't get reported on for OPSEC reasons, or there's just not tools to give us visibility into those areas, or at least not tools to give us visibility into enough facts to paint the story. And so there's all of these things that keep happening in the Black Sea that we see kind of glimpses of and glimmers of in little stories that pop up from Rybar or lots of other places. And you never really know how much to take those reports as factual or wishful or what they are. But there's definitely a lot more going on in the Black Sea and with the Ukrainian Navy than anybody really realizes or reports on. And I really hope that in 20 years, I can read a book that details out all of those things that happen, because I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating.
And that's not even to talk about these rigs that are out there
right,
acting as platforms, and there's all sorts of crazy stuff going on. A bunch of questions here. So is it not naive to believe Ukraine is not using, a couple of double negatives there, is not using ships or ports to export or import military equipment? Do you think they are doing that? I mean,
no,
the Russians aren't, I guess, checking the ships anymore. So would
they're not checking the ships anymore specifically, or at least that we know of. I'm sure that they're not. I am quite positive that Ukraine's allies and the people who are working with them to make this productive. So we talked about the UK, USAID, the different insurance companies, all of those people. I'm certain that one of their prerequisites for working with Ukraine as closely as they are on this is, do not piss around with these cargo ships. Do not import and export things on these cargo ships. If we find out that you're doing that, we will pull cooperation, because it's not useful for each of those partners who are working with them to have that kind of relationship. They don't want to be participants in the war. And so I'm sure that that is not happening simply because their partners wouldn't allow it to happen. I'm sure that there's, like, I shouldn't say, I suspect it's possible that maybe there's some Navy ships that run up and down the coastline doing some patrolling and things like that we don't hear about on purpose, obviously. And I don't know what those ships are doing. Just like I just said, we don't know what a vast majority of is going on in the Black Sea. But do I think it has anything to do with those ports and those cargo ships? No, absolutely not.
Thanks for that. And Catherine Clark here says, exit, any war ties to the Kametla, the grain ship that sunk off of Turkey. So this is... Yeah.
That's a second ship. So there's the ship that we talked about earlier was the Palada. Yep. No, that was the... Go back.
Was that? Oh, that was the... Yeah.
Is it that one? No, one over from that, one right of her.
This is... yeah, sorry, but these are ones... We talked earlier about mines, and I didn't actually show those ships.
So, that one. So if you just scroll down on that. So that was the Palada. That's the one that broke up in the middle of a port town in Turkey. So literally 100 yards off of where this ship is, in the same port area, is this other ship, the Kametler. I probably screwed that up too, but that's okay. It was being washed against one of the breaks there. And it's the ship that I said they believe the entire crew seems to be missing off that ship. And I just don't understand how that's even possible, because as far as I understand, it's in that same port area and literally 100 yards from this other ship that broke into. To my knowledge, that ship doesn't have anything to do with the Ukrainian corridor or the Black Sea Grain Initiative. But if you give me half a second, I will absolutely triple check that.
No problem. And I'm just going to say thanks to Davinci here. So thanks for the super chat. Really appreciate that. I'll probably answer this on behalf of Exit while she's looking up what she's looking up, which is, Exit, would you say the Russians are a bunch of dicks? My answer, I don't want to speak for her, because this is a very important question, but I think the answer might be yes. It's certainly yes from me.
I think, man, I am wary of painting people all with one brush. However, I would say that generally it appears that there's a lot of dickish things done by a lot of Russian people, and that's really frustrating, and I don't understand what the heck their issue is.
Super diplomatic, thank you. Thank you, Parandy, as well, for your super chat. Really, really appreciate that. Did you have your answer yet?
It was part of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, so it ran at least one in and out during the Black Sea Grain Initiative, but it has not gone in as part of the Ukrainian corridor.
Right. Okay. So it's kind of, it's a side issue, really.
Yeah.
Thank you immensely to Mark Bizcu. By the way, Mark, I've decided I'm going to interview you, have a chat with you, irrespective of whether anyone else can join in the panel with you and your wife, if she's willing as well. Let me know if this Sunday or next Sunday works. I'll shoot you an email. Anyway, greetings from fellow Albertans, Elena and Mark. So they are Canadian Ukrainians, as far as I understand. Please help me understand why a coalition of nations can't escort and protect grain shipments in the Black Sea. I mean, I think the Montreux Convention is going to have an awful lot to say about this. What could Turkey possibly do to prevent such a coalition with a firm resolve? Or perhaps, to change the question slightly, is what with the Montreux Convention, you might want to explain exactly what that is. I think it's the most important aspect of this war, is my opinion, of the Montreux Convention. I think this war would have been vastly different without it. Anyway, Turkey could perhaps do that instead of a coalition. But anyway, do you want to tackle that question?
Yeah. So the TLDR on the Montreux Convention is that Turkey controls the Bosphorus Straits. They, because of an international agreement, they essentially can control who goes through the Bosphorus Straits. And part of that agreement says that no nation that's at war, essentially, or any littoral state would be able to bring in any kind of military, well, it's specifically Navy ships is more what you really need to take out of that, without Turkey saying that it was okay to do so. So before the full-scale invasion, there were NATO warships, including some US warships in the Black Sea. As part of de-escalation, they transited out of the Black Sea. However, there are still NATO countries that border the Black Sea. Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey are the three main ones that you really need to keep in your mind. Those NATO countries could, with their assets, technically escort and protect those grain shipments. I would argue that the Ukrainian corridor has proven they don't really need to. That's probably not a popular opinion, but it seems that the evidence supports that right now. What we have seen in the last week, and specifically today, there was an announcement about it this morning, is that those three countries are going to work together to do some minesweeping operations in international and NATO waters, which really is like a big deal that I think people don't understand how big a deal it is. There has been a lot of conversation about the fact that there isn't a lot of mines reported in the Black Sea. How big is the mining issue? Is it really as big as people are kind of putting it out there? And the truth is that a lot of the mines don't get reported. They're seen by a fisherman who goes out and sees a mine, and then he reports it to the Romanian Navy, and the Navy goes and deals with it, and it never makes it to the news. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It just means that it's not getting reported for people like you and I to see on a regular basis. Mines are having way more of an effect for the general use of the Black Sea than kind of anything else that we could have those NATO countries work on right now.
I presume with the Montreux Convention, I'm just starting to think of ideas here. So I presume with the Montreux Convention that Bulgaria and Romania would still have the right to take in their military vessels.
Any military ship that is home ported in the Black Sea can technically transit, like Turkey would. They could request that Turkey let them through, and it's quite likely that Turkey would let them through. So for instance, Romania has just bought two minesweeping ships from the UK. They're the same class as the minesweeping ships that the UK has given to Ukraine. There's no reason that those minesweeping ships couldn't transit through the Bosphorus and go to their home port in Romania tomorrow, essentially.
And what I was thinking is that you pack those ships with a whole load of radar capability and sonar capability, and that acts as an extension to the info, the ISR, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. I don't know. I'm thinking, I'm just spitballing here, but you know, like, yeah, we're going to just send in some minesweepers that are going to help clear mines. And by the way, they're also trying to detect all sorts of other stuff. But anyway.
You could do that, but honestly, the amount of NATO ISR assets that they have flying
in the sky
above
as well,
the Black Sea,
yeah, you're right. Yeah,
it's just not even like, I don't know that you're going to add that much in ISR capability by doing that. So, to be really clear, I'm not saying that escorts wouldn't be a good thing. It's just that those countries don't want to interact with Russia because they don't want to escalate. They are trying to do as much as they can, including minesweeping now in international waters, that shouldn't raise the escalation with Russia. And quietly in the background, like we've talked about with insurance, they're working to make sure that Ukraine can continue their exports in lots of other ways that don't escalate things. And as much as I would love to see escorts, this is probably a better way to go about it because it doesn't escalate that entire conflict to NATO.
So the idea is that escorts would be too escalatory. I guess that's a brilliant question, Mark, by the way. Thank you. And thanks for your overwhelming generosity. Really appreciate that. Terry asks, sorry, Thierry, not Terry. Come on, Pierce, sort it out. Do you think Russia could use the Onyx anti-ship missiles placed in Crimea against civilian ships to interdict the access to Ukrainian ports? Would you ever conceive of them purposefully hitting? Because that one that they hit recently was actually, it was a harm missile. So it was homing in on radar and accidentally hit the ship, really. It wasn't aiming for the ship in the ports.
Yeah, all the evidence that we have supports that theory. Could Russia do that? Yes, they absolutely could. Do I believe that they will do that? There has been so many civilian ships in and out of Ukraine so far. And some of them, like the Ukrainian corridor, is not just grain ships. It absolutely has ships carrying steel. And I'm not even sure what other exports. They don't publish statistics on exactly what exports in and out of that particular corridor. Unlike the Black Sea Grain Initiative, where we got cargo data for every ship going in and out, that doesn't happen with the Ukrainian corridor. I think that if Russia wanted to target civilian ships, they would have already done it. I don't know why they would suddenly wait until the Ukrainian corridor has been open for months. Ship owners are consistently booking ships in and out of those ports. They are consistently booking despite missile attacks and other such threats. I don't know why Russia would suddenly decide that, no, this is the time that we need to attack those ships. I think if you were going to attack ships, you would have done it at the beginning so that you sent the message then that we just don't want anybody going in and out of there. And they haven't done that. And this is maybe not a popular opinion, but I don't think that they are going to intentionally attack the civilian ships. And I think they've made a conscious decision not to do that. And I think that's why the Ukrainian corridor is operating as well as it is.
Awesome. I know time-wise, are you still okay to answer a few questions, or are you constrained for time?
Could we do like 10 more minutes-ish?
Yep. So 10 more minutes, guys. So don't get too many more questions in. Thank you to all of you for your great questions and support as well. We've got 340 people watching this. Make sure you hit the like, as other YouTubers say. Apparently it's good. Right, question. Brian Fielder says, since the UN's World Food Bank was one of Ukraine's largest customers pre-war, why isn't the World Food Bank currently buying most of the grain and alleviating this crisis? I wouldn't know how to answer that.
So my first answer is, I don't think we know that that's not happening. I don't have any proof to say that that is not the case. We did see during the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and especially at the end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, we saw World Food Program ships specifically going in and out of Ukraine and buying a good portion of that wheat. There is still the Grain from Ukraine program, which the Ukrainian government works with, and they have funded $34 million worth of wheat, and they have other countries who have worked with them to fund other wheat and grains out of that particular program to export. The real answer to your question is that the World Food Program is vastly underfunded this year by literally everybody. Like, every country has underfunded it. They just don't have the money to operate the way that we wish they did. And there are lives that will be lost across the world this year because it's underfunded. And so it really doesn't matter where they're buying grain from right now. They don't have huge sums of money to buy grain. And what they do have, they're probably going out and finding the best prices for because they are so budgetarily strapped.
Awesome. Thank you. Great answer. John Larkin says, when all this is over, and thank you for your membership, when all this is over, do we return to the status quo? No sanctions by Russian oil, etc. Do you think that? I personally, my answer to that would be no. I think the world, once bitten, twice shy. I think the world knows where Russia is now, and I would hope not. But then the power of money, the power of cheap energy, the power of cheap food, the power of cheap whatever Russia can offer will have its pull. But I'd hope that we wouldn't just go back to the status quo, because essentially if part of the status quo is predicting that with high accuracy that it's probably going to happen again, then the cost of this happening again would mean that the rest of the world would be hedging their bets and with Ukraine and not getting back into bed with Russia. But those are my thoughts. I don't know, Exit, do you have anything to add?
I do, actually. I think the answer to that question entirely depends on what happens inside Russia. If Putin is still leading Russia, if people like Putin are still leading Russia, it's unlikely that we will see sanctions dropped. I think that if there is a vast sea change politically in Russia, dropping sanctions might be used as a tool to encourage more change and to encourage some political, like how they interact with the outside world politically, to change. And that's where I think those sanctions would be dropped. But it entirely depends on what happens inside Russia.
I'm not sure about this next question because I haven't seen the video. So what's your thoughts on Jake Bro's video on why Ukraine could or should enrich uranium and attack Russia's energy structure, pipelines, plants, and ports?
I have no idea.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks to you, Banks, for that question. I guess this is going back to sort of the discussion we had earlier, which is, should they do that? I can't speak to the enriching uranium, so I don't know the details of that. But as far as attacking Russia's energy structure, that was that question. You might have asked this question before, and then we answered it anyway. But it's that thing about, well, I can see why they would attack the energy infrastructure, and they would gain some strategic advantages by doing so, or at least some kind of operational, I don't know what the right word to use would be, certainly some practical advantages. But I don't think it would be in their best interest with international onlookers and international aid and the kind of moral dimension in public consciousness. So it's kind of what we said earlier. As far as, but thank you very much, Eubanks, really appreciate that. Right, this isn't so much a question, but my goodness, SIUSA 54, thank you so much. That's insanely generous. Thank you, Jonathan and Exit. What a great discussion. You make a great point about NATO air assets in the area and agree that NATO nations escorting the grain ships would not add much, but would raise the risk of escalation. Absolutely. And to be honest, with the curvature of the Earth, unless you're talking about sonar and stuff to do with the water, particularly the sea, particularly, any kind of radar assets are much better in the air, so where you don't have to mess with the curvature of the Earth. Is there anything to talk about with regard to sonar and submarine activity in the Black Sea?
Well, so two things. Regarding the escorting, I would just point out that my answer to that question has definitely changed with how productive the Ukrainian corridor has been. Before that was a reality and a useful reality, I think we probably needed to have a different discussion about whether or not there should be escorts, but it's changed now. And I think that the corridor proves that we don't need it right this minute. Sonar, subs, all of that. So NATO has often P8s up, which can detect subs, is my understanding from the other people I've talked to. I suspect that they have enough information and data on what happens in the Black Sea that they know pretty much everything every day. Whether all of that necessarily gets passed on to Ukraine, I think is a totally different conversation. And I don't think that everything gets passed on to Ukraine by any means. I do think that, for instance, when there were reports of Russia dropping mines in Ukrainian waters, I think we saw an increase in ISR assets up during that time. I think that they probably have a very good idea of exactly where those mines or mine-like objects were dropped. In this past week, I think it was Friday, I believe it's Denmark, they have donated 5 USVs to Ukraine that will be able to detect mines. And I suspect that's exactly what these particular USVs are for, detecting these mines, figuring out exactly where they are. I don't think that Ukraine has the ability to do anything about those mines right now, but I believe that they will at least then be able to say, okay, don't sail here, or this is for sure a mine, or it's for sure not a mine. Whichever the case, more information will be very useful. And these didn't get a lot of attention, but I can tell you right now, they are a really big deal and should be celebrated a lot more than people are paying attention to them.
Yeah, they'd actually been some have been promised. I don't know whether it's the same ones just been re-announced, but some had been promised like a month, maybe 2 months ago, or something like that. I reported on them previously, and then this week it came out again, and I don't know if it's the same ones or not.
Well, and so there were smaller ones that were meant for around like the port areas that could operate in much more shallow water. These are the only ones that I've actually seen come in, or anybody's talked about, that could operate in the majority of the Black Sea, which is completely different than any other assets that I've seen go into there. All the other ones were fairly shallow water or like rivers.
Yeah. Brilliant. But thank you so much, SRUSA 54, and that sparked off some good discussion. Just very quickly, it's not even around a drinks down a pub, but it's my contribution. You work 7 days a week. Many thanks, JP. Thanks, AJ Simon. You are an absolute diamond. Really appreciate that. And Aussie T, thanks for your membership. Thank you both. Great to hear from Exit. Yes, it is. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Now, here's, from what I can gather, I think probably going to be the final question for you, Exit, and it's definitely pertinent to you and gives you maybe an opportunity, because I don't know what this is going on about, but gives you an opportunity to talk about your other appearances and what you do. So Exit appears on Thursdays on Bond Space. Is there any way to catch it later or separately, e.g. YouTube or podcast, for those of us who don't or refuse to get Twitter?
I am working on that. There is nothing right at the moment. We were on YouTube, but we've stopped doing that for the time being. I am working.
What is that? Let people. Can you let people know what it is that you do?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I absolutely can. So on Twitter, there's an account called Hello Mr. Bond. I work with him. Every Thursday and Sunday, we produce what is essentially a podcast, but it's with Twitter Spaces, and we do have a whole bunch of other guests come up and join us and kind of add in their expertise, because you cannot be an expert in absolutely everything. And so they come and contribute to the conversation. We'll often have guests on. We had Jahara Matasek 2 weeks ago, and we also had a deminer from Ukraine come in. We have guests kind of every couple of weeks. And so we do those Thursday nights at 9 p.m. New York time, and Sundays at 4 p.m. New York time. They are exclusively on Twitter right now, and you can do the replays. We always record them. You can do the replays on Twitter, but I am working to get it on a podcast, and I will poke the powers that be and tell them they need to get their butt in gear on the podcast, and that there's another request for this.
Nice one. And I said a final one. This is a final one. John Larkin says, okay, Exit. Are you called Exit? Please let it be KLF linked. Now, for those of you that weren't alive in the 1990s, at least were living far before the 1990s, or indeed afterwards, there's a band called KLF that burned £1 million, famously. Why would you burn £1 million? Why? Anyway, would you like to answer that?
I would love to answer that. So my Twitter handle is exit266. And that is, there's 2 people on Twitter who have figured this out, but it is my favorite exit. And if you want to go find exit266 in Alberta, you'll probably figure out why I might like that exit.
Fabulous. Well, there you go. Nothing to do with KLF. I'm so sorry to let you down, John, and for Exit to have let you down. But if you can pretend that she's named after something to do with KLF.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aussie T. Really kind of you to gift a membership. Look, is there anything else you would like to say, Exit, or where can people find you? I know you've just talked about that, and please go and check Exit out on Twitter. I'm actually going to add Exit to my list of sources so that I'll be hopefully producing some maritime grain agricultural news to my daily news feed. So thanks for reminding me to do that. But any sort of final words?
I would say this week we saw Ukraine's corridor surpass the Black Sea Grain Initiative as more ships in and out per day than average during the same time period last year. And that is a huge, giant feat for them, considering that they really have like no consistent large proportional ability to protect their maritime interests the same way that Russia does. The fact that they've been able to encourage cooperation with their allies, to encourage cooperation with shippers and others who want to work with Ukraine to keep their economy going. This is like, it's not a small feat. And I know that it's not sexy, and like economics and grain and all of these other things are things that people don't really like to pay attention to, because like they should just work and you shouldn't really have to pay attention to. But it is really important to watch these ships going out, being delivered to other countries, providing food and just like economic prosperity for Ukraine, but to all of these other countries. And without these exports continuing, we are going to see a global impact. And it continues to be impressive to me that Ukraine is able and capable of doing this in the middle of a full-scale war being prosecuted against them. And yeah, I want people to pay a little bit more attention to it. You don't have to pay attention to it every day, but like, I don't know, once in a while, pay attention to what goes on with exports.
Absolutely, well said. Paddy Pliner says the only Tim Hortons in Alberta. I don't know what he's talking about, but some kind of Alberta reference. Exit is amazing when she joins Andrew Perpetua's stream, and I think you'll find she's excellent when she joins this stream as well. Like, don't forget this. She's been wonderful, so thank you. Look, can I just say thank you to Jan Harry Russ for gifting memberships. It's so generous of you. Really do appreciate that. Twice indeed, so that's amazingly kind. And just before I sort of sign off and let Exit say the very final word, thank you to Davinci, thank you to Para Andy, thank you to Eubanks, John Larkin, AJ Simo, Aussie T, John Larkin again, Aussie T, Jan Harry Russ, the Weasel as well. Really appreciate that, and particularly, of course, Mark Bizq, as ever. What a legend! Para Andy, I think I forgot, and SR USA 54, just insanely generous. So thank you. It's been really interesting. Thank you very much, Exit. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being here. And I hope at some time in the not too distant future we can maybe go for a second bite of the apple, because there's so many questions I had that I hadn't asked you yet. So I don't know. Hopefully it wasn't too onerous being on.
No, this is great. I would love to come back. That would be great.
Oh, that's fabulous. Well, look, final words for you. Any last words of wisdom?
Words of wisdom. Eat more cake. It's good for you. Makes you happy.
That is a tremendous mantra to live by. Eat more cake, guys. Take care, everybody. Really appreciate all of your support. You are fantastic. Continue being legends, and I will speak to you all tomorrow. Stay on the stream, Exit, and in the meantime, everyone, toodle pips.